Hello and welcome to Outlaw Astrology, the podcast that explores the cosmic connections behind history's most notorious criminals and crimes, with a touch of the unexplained and inexplicable thrown in for good measure. I'm your host, APM, and I'm also your intrepid star guide and cosmic detective. And this is episode 1 of season 8. Now, before we dive in, a quick reminder to like, share, subscribe, and leave a 5-star review. Thank you very much if you're enjoying the program. And now let's set our celestial sights on one of the most infamous cult murders in history, the Manson family murderers. In this episode, we'll be examining the astrological aspects surrounding the murders and seeking insights into the cosmic climate of the late 1960s. And during this shocking series of crimes, we'll also be exploring the planetary positions, zodiacal influences, and celestial events that coincided with these notorious but disturbing and gruesome acts. And so let's set the stage of the Age of Aquarius. Now, you might be thinking that eruptions don't usually erupt. You might be thinking they just set it off. The 60s was all counterculture, and so yoga, meditation, etc. started out there, which it did not. Yoga came to the shores of the United States via Yogananda, along with Eastern philosophy, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and we had people studying with him as early as the 20s and well into the 30s. So his book was being read and his ideas were being fermented all across the United States by people. A matter of fact, during that Prohibition era, that was when this was going on, and by the 30s, which was the time of the Depression, where people didn't have a lot all over the world, and people partied like it was 1999, except that it wasn't, simply because it was a hard life, and that was how you let off steam. And during that time, we had the Nazi Party doing its rise, and moving on into the 40s when the war started, and you might think that a person who did yoga and was into veganism and did LSD would not be a Nazi, and you'd be incorrect. Some of the higher-ranking Nazis were all three of those things, and it did not result in wonderful experiences for Jewish people and other people the Nazis did not feel deserved to exist. You'll also might think that LSD and things of that nature were a counterculture 1960s thing, and they were not. LSD was conceived of in the 1930s at Sandoz by Albert Hofmann, who accidentally got a tiny bit of LSD upon his finger, and I believe it's the 30s, on his finger, and tripped all the way home on a bike ride. And the company, by the way, is Sandoz. And so it was at that point that LSD was being very much studied through the 30s, 40s, and mostly 50s, before that got cut off abruptly. So this is the start of that wave that leads to the 1960s. And then you got the war in the 1940s, which led to people wanting stability and safety and security and things to make sense, which at first felt very freeing. And then by the late 50s, where rock and roll started to bloom and erupt, then it was stultifying. But the civil rights movement was still very much in play, because we have 1955, where Rosa Parks sat down on a bus in the white section of the bus, not the black section, and refused to get up, at which point that made civil rights more of a noticeable thing. So you're starting to see those fissures happening in the late 50s. By the early 60s, we had civil rights movement well in play, but we also had people being disappeared off the earth. Keeping in mind also that you were not free, you didn't have free use of your body either at that time. If you were gay, you were very much in the closet. If you're lesbian, you were in the closet. If you were black, you tried to stay out of the way. If you were indigenous, marginalized voice, you tried to stay out of the way and live and let live and try to get on the best way you could. That is the energy. So by the time the 60s arrived, with that Uranus-Pluto conjunction in Virgo, you had a convergence of disruption, and this has all got to go. And Virgo is self-improvement, and it's very idealistic. How can we make this more efficient? How can we make society work for everybody, not just the chosen few? And so, that is the energy that we walked into. And the things I've just said were all about, all the things, the events I named were all confluences. Now, one more thing, well, a few more things. Hare Krishna movement was starting to spike up as well, because their leader had arrived in the 60s in New York on American soil. So that was starting to rise as well. We're starting to get more of that Eastern philosophy, that yoga, that confluence, because everybody was trying to figure out a way to leave behind that stultification and that mediocrity that became with being working class or lower middle class and middle class existence. It started to be very stultifying, and people were just itching to get out, screaming to get out. And so we have Bob Dylan being the voice of that particular movement with his folk before he went electric and then drove everyone insane. We had people sharing communal, so socialism was on the rise, at least those ideals. We had people pushing drug use to open people up, so a lot of LSD was being used. A lot of jam bands like Grateful Dead, for example, jam bandy type vibe, where people would trip out on music and listen and do drugs at the same time, kind of thing. The Summer of Love was in 1967. In 1966, we had the debut of Star Trek. And that is the program in which we had the first interracial kiss on national television in the United States ever in history. Star Trek holds that distinction in television history. The kiss was between Lieutenant Uhura, played by Nichelle Nichols, and James T. Kirk, played by William Shatner. And so that was a sea change rise. Also, Star Trek had a multi-culti crew. You had people of color appearing on the show as well. You know, at a time pushing humanitarian, Aquarian values, by the way. And so this is the energy of that time. Now, as I've said, we've looked at Charles's chart, and so that Aquarian ideals that you're seeing and you hear me talk about makes perfect sense. His moon is there. Moon is basically what you're attached to. Utopianism, socialism, ideas like that. How to make society a better place. You don't think that people signed up with him because their locus, their internal locus was broken, or they were broken in some way. Yes, they probably wanted to improve themselves. Yes, they were all refugees from that stultifying middle-class existence that everyone was told was supposed to be so wonderful, but very few people found it to be wonderful. Because, and I'm getting to it, relationships started to shift. People no longer wanted to be married to people that they felt no connection to, who no longer shared their values. Also, this was a time of great fruition, a great social activism started to be a big thing. People were standing up for social rights. You saw a lot of universities where people got hurt for speaking out about eventually what was going to become the war in Vietnam, and a war in particular. And what's going on in the rest of the world. It seemed as if suddenly people understood that the United States was not, or England or France, was not an island. It was part of a much bigger picture, which is part of the cosmos, by the way. And so that is the energy. Now let's look at Manson's chart, because I may have spoke ill. He was born on the 12th of November, 1934. His sun is in Scorpio, and it is in the 7th house, and it is conjunct Venus. And so, on a good note, he likes intimacy. He wants to be close to people. He yearns for that, needs that. His self-expression is to be intimate. However, the downside of Venus in Scorpio conjunct the Sun, for one thing, Venus in Scorpio is not the best placement. Venus is very happy in Taurus, but Scorpio, it has to struggle and learn. And one of the challenges is power issues, control in a relationship, and emotional manipulation, and sometimes ghosting or shutting down emotionally. So that's one of the disadvantages. That is part of a much bigger energy, by the way. The Sun is not alone there. It is also there with Jupiter, the descendant, and Mercury as well. And what that all means is that's called a stellium. That makes his chart signature very scorpionic. And so the good news is Scorpios are like, yeah, but why? So he wanted to understand people. He wanted to know what made people tick. That's how I read that seventh house. In particular, those he was in intimate connection with, which wasn't a common thing for him because he was so focused on his own needs. He had a tendency to ignore the fact that other people had needs as well. And so when he did this why, yeah, but why, and excuse me, he would usually do it from a place of what's in it for him. He was a world championship grudge holder. All that energy right there. The downside is grudge holding. And by the way, his moon is out of bounds. And that means it is in Aquarius. And that means it can do anything because it is not moored anymore. It's at 28 degrees. That's way out of bounds. And out of bounds would be starting at 23 degrees, 26 minutes to 23 degrees, 28 minutes, and moving on. So those could be the beginning, but it could go on as far as the planet would be allowed to go out of bounds. I've seen 30 degrees, but not often. Mostly it's about 28, maybe 29, but 28's pretty far out of bounds, which means emotionally, mentally, there would be a separation between feeling and thinking. And if you can't feel, it's very difficult to empathize with people, sympathize with their plight. So this would be a very idealistic, but very cool, and sometimes cold moon. Because it may not always have the ability to feel. And by the way, that moon's calling the shots from the 10th house on the 3rd house, which is where Pluto, which rules shot calls for that entire stellium and Scorpio in the 7th house, is sitting. Which means Charles, tends to make decisions from a place of split. Meaning that they're motivated, his emotions and power and control issues come from childhood, come probably from, the way he was nurtured. This is all 3rd house, that's early childhood. Early childhood pedagogy, meaning training, learning. And Pluto has the part of fortune there in Cancer. It has the IC there in Cancer. And it also has, on the other side of it at 29 degrees, the Black Moon Lilith also in Cancer at 20, as I said, at 29. 29 is important because that's a big energy. It's a chance to learn about how to nurture someone mentally, how to nurture their ideas, how to nurture someone's mind, and also teach them to be empathetic. I think that hit the mark, rather, with Charles. And so that Pluto is at 26 degrees, but is still enough for it to be 8 degrees off of the sun at least. And so Venus is Sun, about 8 degrees, 7-8 degrees for both. And what does that mean? Someone who might have a tendency to be emotionally manipulative, who knows how to say the right things from childhood, was taught by people around him because he was surrounded by people who were very impulsive and self-interested, and he lived in a chaotic life, so would have learned on the fly through his own observations how to manipulate people so he could have power and control over them. And that he would not always have the ability to empathize with people, but that he could definitely fake it. The chart ruler here, by the way, is Venus in Scorpio, because the ascendant is in Taurus. So he likes the good life, and he likes to turn on, and he likes what he likes and what he wants, but not terribly interested particularly in what might be good for other people or anything else. So he was very charismatic, by the way. You got Venus conjunct the sun by 1 degree. We got a very magnetic, charismatic personality. He would literally draw people to him like a moon or a shuttle on Star Trek in a tractor beam. He would literally be able to pull people just like that. And it was, easy because he knew how to talk to people. He understood people well enough to understand that people like to talk about themselves. And so Charlie would walk up to people and start conversations, and he'd draw them out. And they'd start, before they knew it, telling him about their lives and the pain they were in or the chaos they were experiencing, and he wouldn't judge. He would just listen. He'd say, hey, why don't you come hang out over here at this ranch, and we got some friends, we're going to do some cool stuff. And what person does not want to be part of a movement to change the world? Because if you ask any of them, if you've ever listened to any of the documentaries where any of the people, Squeaky Fromme, any of the people who were once Manson family members, you will note that Charlie, well, for one thing, he wasn't involved in most of them. He told people what to do. He orchestrated things because he's got a very strong Scorpio aspect in his chart. But they all said that he listened and he never judged. And that's going to be very attractive if you're used to being judged, which who hasn't? And takes an interest in you. Who isn't fascinated by that? I'm going to change the world. Be part of something bigger than you. He absolutely tapped into 3 major human needs that most people don't pay attention to and don't usually have much mindfulness about in the first place. So that is just a bit of Charlie's chart. I will also add that he has a lot of squares, which can be motivating. Oprah has a lot of squares in her chart, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work out that way, because keep in mind, the chart is the chart, yes, but you got to work it. So you got a choice. It could say that, and you'll note there's a lot in his chart that says that he can make an impact. By the way, he's got Mars and Neptune conjunct in the 5th house in Virgo, which means motivated to make a difference in the world, motivated to serve, to be idealistic. But those ideals can be easily corrupted, as we have seen, and to make a difference through music, because people were in that late period. So that is the energy of Charles Manson, adding to the energy that led up to 1969. Now, in this final segment, we're going to talk about, because this could be a really long podcast, to be fair, and if you're interested, do feel free to comment, share, and download, and let me know if this is content that you would be interested in for the long term, because I'm only doing it so far for season 8. But we'll see for the future. In any case, we are looking at what happened for the Tate LaBianca murders. And when you hear Tate LaBianca murders, those murders are the murders perpetrated by the Manson family starting on the 9th and 10th of August 1969 in Los Angeles, California. They were done under the direction of Tex Watson, who was a Manson family member, currently serving time in prison for these murders, and Charles Manson. It involved 5 people being killed starting from the night of August 8th through 9, including pregnant actress Sharon Tate, her companions Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, and if the name Folger sounds familiar, it's because she was the Folger coffee heiress, and Wojciech Frykowski, along with Stephen Parent, who happened to just be there for the time. So the family had previously committed murders starting from the 9th. At the following evening, a supermarket executive known as Lino LaBianca and his wife Rosemary were then killed in their home in the Los Feliz section of Los Angeles on the 10th. So starting with the 9th, let's look at the stars and see. By the way, if I've not said, and I really should have said, spoiler alert, I will put that in the show notes. The sun on the 8th was in Leo. Let me change that because I want to check out all of this. So the sun was absolutely in Leo, and on the 8th, and the moon on the 8th was at 18 degrees of Gemini. Clever, information, plans. The moon is in shape-shifty Gemini, which means feelings and thoughts and emotions would probably change quite a bit. They would be ascending and peaking, ascending and peaking, ascending and peaking. And that would be a sextile between the sun and the moon, because the sun is at 16 degrees 15, the moon was at 18 degrees 7 of Gemini, and so in a sextile, but you still got to work it. So that means, ideally, being seen and heard and speaking your ideas could be a good thing. It just so happens that when Charlie shared his, usually it resulted in other people not being alive anymore, you know. Mercury was at 1 degree of Virgo on the 8th, on the 9th is at 3, and on the 10th it was at 4. And Mercury on the 8th and 9th was, so it's definitely in Virgo. Venus was in Cancer at 5 degrees on the 8th, 6 on the 9th, and on the 10th it was at 7 degrees. And so that is an exaltation by hermetically. And that is 5 degrees, so about 7 degrees off as a rule. It's a little wide, but you could definitely, if you wanted to, consider this to be a sextile. But like I said, you still got to work it. Mercury is at home in its own sign of Virgo, so very analytical. You'd have to be able to analyze, to be able to come up with a step plan to get rid of people who did nothing wrong to you. But you see clearly from, if you read the Wikipedia page and watch the documentaries and read the books, this clearly did not go as planned. Venus in Cancer is about being nurturing and caring, and what got nurtured instead was grudges and ill feelings. Mars is in Sag, and its declination is at 24 degrees south, 52 minutes, which means it's out of bounds. And that means this Mars is idealistic, but it's also self-righteous. I know I'm doing the right thing. These people gotta go. They're bad people. Now you just gotta come up with a preachy philosophy about it and sell it to people, and you can sell it on a big picture. And here's the philosophy you're going to sell. Because Sag energy is great preacher energy. So you sell people on a worldview. Imagine a world where the pigs are gone. That means the straight world, the establishment. Imagine that world. It's all over. It's gone. And we get to create the new world. But we have to get rid of the old first. So, we got to start with these people. And you don't lead with the fact that you wanted to have a singing career and write songs and you hung out with one of the Beach Boys. You don't lead with that. You lead with, we're creating a new world here. You're part of something bigger, which made everybody who was involved feel special. Works every time. Keith Raniere used it. Jim Jones used it. I mean, it's highly effective. And moving on to Jupiter. Jupiter's at 3 degrees out of Libra. That's about a 4 degree spread with Mars. So Jupiter and Mars. Jupiter, it's great. Mars is assertion. You can assert yourself and with ideals, with a worldview. You know, taking in different people from different parts of the country and putting them together as one family, which Jim Jones also did. But so did Charles Manson. And at 3 degrees of Libra, we've got Jupiter, and that is a change in relationships. But it also can mean excess. Yeah, we're polyamorous, yeah, we don't have boundaries, or we've blown them all out of control, but it's also an over-optimism. So Jupiter also is the short color for that Mars. So maybe a little optimistic, may have oversold the story, which is how it was supposed to go, is like this. Charles sold everybody on the idea that there would be a race war and that people of color would win, but they would not know how to rule properly. And since Manson and his family had been doomsday prepping for quite a while at a rural ranch, they would be still there and able to take the reins of power and recreate the world whatever way they wanted. Sounds wonderful. Awesome, doesn't it? And so Jupiter, you need relationships with that. You need charm. You need to be able to convince people that the way you see the world is an accurate way to see the world. So very charming and charismatic. Knew how to talk. Knew how to get people to come close. And also knew how to charm people into doing things for him that they probably should never have done. We've got Taurus, a Saturn in Taurus. That would put it in his first house, by the way, in Charles's first house. And this is for the energy of the day. And that would mean that 8 degrees of Taurus would fall in Saturn, would fall in his first house, which would be in opposition to his Jupiter and his descendant, and also his Mercury. So Mercury, his descendant, and his Jupiter would all be in opposition to that 8-degree Saturn. So it's a chance to make a choice. Do you follow your own self-interest? What turns you on? What interests you? Do you hold grudges? Or do you seek, to have real, true connections with people that isn't based on manipulation? But at this point, I think the likelihood, because Saturn wants to set rules and boundaries, the likelihood of that happening was not exactly high. So it became a tug of war of who had, who didn't had, and who displeased me. And moving on, we've got Chiron in Aries, forming a trine with Mars at 7 degrees. And Chiron and Mars, by the way, if we're going to look at his natal chart, it would be his Mars. This Mars would be transiting his 8th house. And that is the house of transformation, but it's also grief and loss, meaning that whatever actions he takes based on his ideals, it might cost someone. And it eventually cost him his freedom, and it cost a lot of other people their lives. And it cost other people who listened to him their freedom as well. And so that would be transiting over his 8th house and would be in a trine aspect. So Chiron is old wounds, independence, rugged individualism. He's basically selling rugged individualism on a grand scale to a bunch of people, and that's part of the energy of how he chooses to see the world. And in his chart, Aries would fall in the 10th house. So that means that Chiron would be in the 10th house of his public image, which was ruggedly individual, fiery, and very doing my own thing the way I want to do it kind of vibe. Uranus and Jupiter are in a conjunction on this particular day. And so Uranus would be bringing disruption in relationships, in connections, socially to the social order, and Jupiter would be inflaming all of that, making things big. So the social order was about to get ripped to shreds, as it were. So at that time, a lot was going on energetically for that murder. So we're going to step into that. And so on the night of 8th, 9th, 4 members of the Manson family, Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, drove from Span Ranch to Benedict Canyon, at which point they entered the home of Tate and murdered her and her unborn child, and then continued to do the same with guest Jay Sebring, a hairdresser, Abigail Folger, and Abigail's boyfriend, Mr. Frykowski, an aspiring screenwriter, and Stephen Parent was a guest house caretaker, which is why he also had to be taken care of. He was just there inconveniently. The house was supposed to belong to one Terry Melcher, who had previously rented the house, and that's who Manson was going there to get. He had hoped to get a record deal and felt Mr. Melcher had gotten in the way of his aspirations of being seen and heard as a folk musician and wanted revenge. He was a sort of person who held grudges. The following night, on the 10th, 4 these same people, including, in addition to Manson, along with Leslie Van Houten and Steve Clem Grogan, committed 2 more murders, and he went to show them how to do it. Kasabian drove the group but did not enter, and Manson then left Atkins, Grogan, and Kasabian in the car and went back to and told the others to hitchhike back to the ranch, and then Watson, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten entered the home and committed the murders on the 10th of August. Okay, so on the 8th, that's the energy. So the outer planets obviously did not change. I mentioned there was a Mars and Jupiter connection, and there was also a Jupiter-Uranus connection, which is not common for those two to come up. And so what does that say about these crimes? What does that say? Well, it's like highly idealistic, very charming, very articulate, and that Jupiter would be going through his fifth house. So the transiting Jupiter would be going through the 5th house, and also there'd be Uranus also there, so they're conjunct in the 5th house, and that's about creativity, it's about play, it's about hobbies, it's about dating, and it's what those 2 planets might be saying to other planets around the same degree. So in a trine with the optimistic and utopian idealistic North Node with the moon right there. Right there is already telling you the moon is not known for being, what's the word I would use, reasonable, rational. It's the ability to rationalize our emotions is the difference. So if you've got that trine there, there's an ease of being able to rationalize your personal activities and their excess of those activities, and then write that large on the world, which is basically what happened. So he told himself a story about how he was going to change the world, and he sold his family members, his cult members, on the idea that these deaths would result in an ameliorating change for society, which would then be for the betterment of them, but it'd also be in Charlie's best interest, because then he could be in control and be the person behind the curtain like he'd always wanted to be. Now, does astrology explain every little thing about people? No, it does not. And so, this is a good stopping point. And we will pick up in the next episode. So, as we conclude our astrological journey through the Manson family murders, at least temporarily, we're going to ponder the complex interplay between free will and cosmic influence, which is what we will talk about in the next episode. And our key takeaway is, whilst the stars may set the stage, it's human choices that write the script, for better or for worse. So, For homework, I encourage you to research the astrological charts of some of the family members, or if there are any crimes that interest you or dark parts of history, draw up charts. You can do that in any software of your choosing, and notice what common threads or interesting divergences you may find. So, this has been APM, your intrepid star guide and cosmic detective, reminding you that even in the darkest of times, the stars offer a perspective. And until next time, keep your eyes on the skies and your moral compass steady.